Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. First, I just want to mention that this year is dedicated in memory of Chayesara Borg, Chayesara Bas Alter Benzina HaKohen. I always mention her and her husband, when their yard site comes, they were neighbors of ours. They were members of my shul, uh, and the she came from Europe together with her husband, and there is, besides the Masorah of Torah of learning, there are Masorahs which is part of the Torah also, the Masorah of the midos, of the traits, the character traits of the Jewish people in Europe, and her and her husband, they portrayed those character traits. That's something that we don't have in America today. That so, but and in addition, and I'm going to speak about it today to a certain degree. Uh, the what is fast disappearing is the Masorah of the Jewish people in Europe, the tragedy of the Jewish people in Europe, what the Jewish people encountered in Europe. And the first generation in America did receive it, but unfortunately, the future generations are not receiving it. And she and her husband is part of that generation, the linkage that that gave over that Masorah. And unfortunately, because of all kinds of reasons, for some reason, this Masorah has become very weakened in recent years. And this is part of what Zachor is. Zachor, remember. And it's not just in regard to Amalek, although, of course, it certainly applies to Amalek, how we suffered at the hands of the anti Semites. But Zchor Yemo Solam, Shninu Bnos Dor V'Dor, Sha'alavicha V'Yagetcha, Skenecha V'Yomru Lach. In Hazinu, we're told to remember history, because if we don't remember history, we're going to make mistakes that the Jewish people are going to suffer from, and unfortunate that we are already suffering from. Uh, we see what's going on today. I always mention Freud said that that sometimes the power of hatred is greater than the power of love. And we see some people, very strangely, Jews, people who identify themselves as Jews, but apparently not their main identification. And for some reason, they want to identify, their main identification is with the political left. So, so the hatred that they have for the people in the on the right, it forces them to act in a manner that is demonstrative of hatred to the Jewish people. There are those that when the United States, when Trump tries to help the Jewish people, they in their minds, they abandon the Jewish people, the existence of the Jewish people, the perpetuation of the Jewish people, the perpetuation of the Jewish nation becomes secondary to their political identification. We look forward to having Rachmanis v'Hakadosh Baruch Hu, and in spite of the attitudes that these people have, we look forward to Hakadosh Baruch Hu helping the Jewish people in their struggle today for survival. Okay,
Oh, that's what I can remember. Was it last week that your father mentioned a whole story about Freud, about that?
Yeah.
about that hate is stronger, and someone when he mentioned to his father, your grandfather said,
I
"Oh, it's a
mean,
rush and
it's
Mako."
about. I know
So
the whole story.
that's why I said that your father went into it in some detail in the Torah Madash. That was the point.
Yes, yes, yeah. I know, I know. I heard this Torah this year also.
I know.
Okay, okay. So anyway, there seems to be a machlokus between the Magen Avram and the Mishnah Berurah. If somebody did not hear the Parsha of Zachor Asher Asal Lecha Molek this past Shabbos, so the Magen Avram says they could fulfill the mitzvah of Schiras Hamalek, of remembering what Amalek did by listening Purim to the Parsha Vayavo Amalek. There are two Parshas. Two the Amalek is mentioned twice in the Torah. In Parshas B'Shalach, the Torah tells us how Amalek attacked the Jewish people, how Amalek tried to destroy, how Amalek came from far away to attack the Jews who were not anywhere near their territory. It was pure hatred of the Jewish people. Very similar to the situation that we have today in Iran. Israel is not encroaching from any perspective of Iranian territory. And to a large degree, Israel has made peace with many of the nations that are around it. I should add, a large part of it is due to the efforts of President Trump. No one can deny that the Abraham Accords and similar understandings were made only during his administration. But nevertheless, who is the arch enemy of the Jewish people? Who has built up cells of terrorism in all kinds of countries against the Jewish people? And by the way, even in the United States, of course, not to the same degree. It's not like Hezbollah. It's not like like the group in Gaza, like Hamas. But nevertheless, Iran is more determined to, and the religious leader of Iran, when he was asked many years ago, what does he see as his goal in Iran? And he said the destruction of the state of Israel. And when he talks about the destruction of the state of Israel, he's not just talking about the destruction of the state. He's talking about his desire to destroy the Jewish people. Now, and it's not limited to the Jewish people, but the Jewish people are number one on his list. Now, there is a machlokas between the Magen Avram and the Mishnah Berurah about if somebody did not hear Parsha Zachor, which tells us about the requirement to remember what Amalek did to the Jewish people and our obligation under a certain set of circumstances to wage war and destroy Amalek. So, according to the Magen Avram, he could fulfill the mitzvah of Schiras Amalek with the last parsha in the Sedra of B'Shalach. Because in the last parsha, the Sedra of B'Shalach, the Torah tells us how Amalek attacked the Jewish people. And the mitzvah is a mitzvah of remembering what Amalek did to the Jewish people. But the Mishnah Berurah suggests that a person could be of the opinion that there is reason to believe that in order to fulfill the mitzvah of Schiras Hamalek, it has to be with the Parsha of Zachor, because there it says, Macho Timcha Zachor Hamalek, eradicate the memory of Amalek. And the obligation of Schiras Amalek, according to the Mishnah Berurah, according to the Chinuch, and it seems from the Rambam also, that the reason we have to remember the what Amalek did to the Jewish people is that we have to mentally prepare ourselves to wage war against Amalek when it is the appropriate time. So he says in Vayava Amalek, the Torah tells us about how Amalek attacked the Jewish people. It tells us how Moshe Rabbeinu went on top of the mountain and prayed for God's aid in the war against Amalek at that time. It tells us about God taking an oath and saying, Milchama Lashem ba'Amalek midor dor, there's a war, God's war. But according to Mishnah Berurah, there is no mention in the Sedra about the responsibility in that Parsha, about the responsibility of the Jewish people to ultimately wage war against Amalek at the proper time. And consequently, one does not fulfill, according to the Mishnah Berurah, the mitzvah of Schiras Amalek. One does not fulfill the mitzvah of Schiras Amalek with the Parsha of Vayavo Amalek. Because Vayavo Amalek tells us about the historical event. Vayavo Amalek tells us about God's commitment that Amalek will be destroyed. But according to Mishnah Berurah, Vayavo Amalek does not talk about our obligation to engage in war with Amalek, whereas the pasuk, the Parsha Zachor, there it talks about the mitzvah of waging war against Amalek. And I have difficulty with what the Mishnah Berurah said. First of all, even if we make the assumption of the Mishnah Berurah that part of the mitzvah of Schiras Hamalek is to make ourselves aware of our obligation, to wage war against Amalek. But the pasuk Milchama Lashem ba'Amalek can be and is interpreted in two ways. One way it's interpreted is it's God's war against Amalek. And the second way it's interpreted is that it's our war for God. And from different Gemaras and different Maimorei Chazal, it appears that both pshatim are correct. So we could say that included in the pasuk of Milchama Lashem ba'Amalek midor dor, there's a war for God against Amalek is implied an obligation on the Jewish people who act as God's agents to wage war against Amalek. But I think even without that, even if we'll assume that the Pashut Pshat, that the simple explanation of Milchama Lashem ba'Amalek midor dor It's talking about the war that God himself wages. And we should we really have to understand that when the Jewish people wage war against Amalek, we see it as God's war. We saw in the we see in the Sedra in Vayava Amalek, which we read on Purim, that when Moshe commands Yoshua to raise an army, B'char lanu anashim, that say hilachem ba'Amalek, Moshe Rabbeinu tells Yoshua, and he goes on top of a mountain, and he raises his hands in prayer on behalf of the Jewish people. V'haya kasher yarim Moshe yado v'gavar Yisrael. And so long as Moshe's hands were raised in prayer, the Jewish people were having a victory against Amalek. But in the situations where the Jewish people where Moshe did not raise his hands in prayer, he was tired. So until Aaron and Hor helped him keep his hands up high, so for Gover Amalek had the edge. And there are all kinds of questions. I've mentioned it in the past. First of all, where is there a halacha that one has to, where is there a halacha that one has to raise their hands? Where is there a halacha that one has to raise their hands in prayer? The prayer is the heart, prayer is oral, but there's no halacha that one has to raise their hands in prayer. Why was it significant here that Moshe Rabbeinu should raise his hands in prayer? And secondly, we find that here Moshe Rabbeinu, and this question is raised by the Abarbanel. Moshe Rabbeinu goes on top of the mountain, and the Abarbanel asks. The Gemara in Brachas says that on the contrary, the halach is that the preferred place to engage in prayer is on a lower level, not on a higher level. As a matter of fact, many of the shuls, many of the synagogues in Europe, where the chazan was on a lower level. So why all of a sudden by Amalek there was a special necessity for Moshe Rabbeinu to go on top of the mountain? Now we know what brought Amalek. What brought Amalek was the Jewish people said, Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu imayin. The Jewish people were wondering shortly before Amalek came, before they knew of the attack of Amalek. They raised doubts. They had a doubt. They expressed doubts whether God is helping them in the war. As a matter of fact, in Kabbalah they say that the word Amalek is b'gematria safek, doubt. And who was interested? Why did Amalek attack the Jewish people? Because Amalek is interested in the non-recognition of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. As Chazal tell us, that God took an oath, "Ein kisi shalem vein shmi shalem, ad shemocha shem Amalek min olam." My throne is not complete because of the Amalek and Amalek's philosophy to prevent seeing God as king of the world. And my name represents recognition of God, is not complete until Amalek is destroyed. Why? Because why did Amalek attack the Jewish people? Because Amalek understood that recognition of God and recognition of the Malchus of God, the recognition of the Malchus of God was would be through the Jewish people. And because of that, Amalek wanted to destroy the Jewish people. So the Jewish people, when they expressed doubts of God's involvement on their behalf, they were attacked by Amalek. But now, for the first time, the Jewish people have to do something for themselves. In Mitzrayim, the Jewish people sat back. They didn't have to lift a finger. You had the 10 makos. And even by Kriyas Yamsuf, Nachshon ben Nadav goes in. But that hardly could explain, from any natural perspective, the splitting of the sea. But now by Amalek, the Jewish people had to fight themselves. But that presented a new challenge for the Jewish people, because there is a tendency that when I do it, a person has a tendency to say, Yadi, Kochi Votzim Yadi Asasachayalazeh. I did it. We have a tendency not to recognize God's hand in our accomplishments, in our survival. So Moshe Rabbeinu had to go on top of the mountain and lift his hands in prayer, because the Jewish people on the battlefield should be able to view him and be able to identify their success in the war with the prayers of Moshe. When Moshe put his hands down. So at that point, the Amalek was beginning to be successful. So the Jewish people, even though I did it, nevertheless, it was HaKadosh Baruch Hu that enabled me to have a victory. And it's very interesting in the Parsha of Zachor Amalek that's mentioned in Kiseitze. Immediately afterwards, in Kisavo, you have the Parsha Bikurim. What is the Parsha Bikurim? The Parsha Bikurim is you take your first fruit, the fruit that you labored for, that you worked for, and you bring it to Yerushalayim, and you recite a Parsha saying how everything that you have was only because of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Asher nosata li Hashem. Recognition of the fact that everything that happened was as a result. Everything that happened was as a result of everything that I accomplished was as a result of the help that I received from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So so because of that, Amalek, the war against Amalek, is identified with the as God's war. In other words, the war against Amalek is a war for God, because God is fighting for the Jewish people, and the Jewish people are fighting for God. It's both. Now but we see that for most of the Rishonim, that it's true that for most of the Rishonim, it appears that, of course, the purpose of Schiras Amalek is, in a sense, to prepare us for the war against Amalek, as the Rambam puts it out in Sefer HaMitzvahs. And the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvahs says that when Shmuel, in talking about the mitzvah of Schiras Amalek, Shmuel said to Agag, just as you made Jewish women lose their children, your mother will lose her child. And that was Skiras Amalek. So the mitzvah of Skiras Amalek manifests itself. Yes, it's because of the war against Amalek, but it's to prepare us to understand who Amalek was. And that will inspire us in the war effort against Amalek. And to a certain degree, it tells us that throughout history, Amalek is determined to destroy the Jewish people. But the Rambam, from the Rambam, it says just to remember what he did. Doesn't emphasize that when we oralize it, we have to say about the war. Of course, the purpose is the war. Reb Nosson Adler, who was the Rebbe of the Chassam Sofer, so Reb Nosson Adler suggests that remembering what Amalek did, of course, there's a mitzvah, there's a mitzvah of Amalek, a waging war against Amalek. But Reb Nosson Adler says that even after Amalek is destroyed, even after there is no nation of Amalek, there still will be a mitzvah of Schiras Amalek, of remembering how Amalek attacked the Jewish people. But for most Rishonim, it doesn't appear that way. And I think from the Raavad in the Safra, you also see that. The Raavad in this parish in the Safra says that one can fulfill the mitzvah of Schiras Amalek in one of four manners. One manner is Vayavo Amalek, the Parsha Vayavo Amalek. You see clearly that the Raavad did not have the same shita as the Mishnah Berurah. And he felt like the Magen Avram, that on Purim, when we read Vayavo Amalek, even though, it depends whether there is a reference to Amalek or there isn't a reference to the war against Amalek, just about the history of Amalek, whatever it is, but you fulfill the mitzvah of Schiras Amalek, of remembering about Amalek with the Parsha Vayavo Amalek. And of course, with the Parsha of Zachor, there it mentions that Amalek attacked the Jewish people, but it also mentions the mitzvah explicitly, Amocho Timcha Zachor Amalek, eradicate the memory of Amalek. And then he adds two more Parshios, Pakadati in Shmuel, which was the Haftorah of this past Shabbos. And then he says, Hilchos Megilla. Now, what is the? Now, my uncle was somewhat intrigued by the expression of Hilchos Megilla. He should have said Megillah Esther. Why Hilchos Megilla? And my uncle understood it, and I'm not sure that that's the exact understanding. But my uncle understood, at least the way I read it. I could be mistaken. But my uncle understood that when it comes to Megillah, learning the halachas about the Megillah is a fulfillment of the mitzvah of Schiras Amalek. It seems somewhat strange. Does that mean that if I learn about a Megillah needing shirtut, needing lines, the way we write a Megillah, or how the Megillah is supposed to be read, or how much of the Megillah should be read from the parchment, from the Megillah itself? If words are missing from the Megillah, whether the reading is a proper reading or it's not a proper reading. So learning these halachas is a fulfillment of Schiras Amalek. That would seem very, very strange, I think. Now, so it seems to me that Hilchos Megilla could be understood in one of two ways. And the first way is also strange. Hilchos Megillah is the observance of the laws that are mentioned in the Megillah, the laws of Purim. But even that's strange because the Torah says, Zachor es asher aso l'cha Amalek, Zachor bepeh, with your mouth. Observing the laws, that has nothing to do with it. And learning the laws about Megillah in Torah Shabbal Peh. Most of the laws of Megillah are not written explicitly in the Megillah. And if we learn it, the halachas of Megillah, Torah Shabbal Peh, this doesn't seem to be an emphasis on oralization. Torah Shabbal Peh, it's understanding that is the main focus. So why should you fulfill the mitzvah of Zikaron Amalek with learning the halachas about Megillah? But I think the reason the Megillah, the Raavad calls the Megillah Hilchos Megilla, because if you look at the structure of the Megillah, the structure of the Megillah is the whole episode, what happened with Mordechai and Esther, Achashverosh, Haman is mentioned. But the goal of the Megillah is to tell us about the halachos of Purim. So in a sense, the Megillah was written primarily to tell us about how Purim is to be celebrated. So therefore, it's called Hilchos Megillah, the laws of Megillah. But it's not that we learn that Schiras Amalek is fulfilled by learning the laws, how to write a Megillah or other laws related to the Megillah. But Hilchos Megillah is the Megillah, just another word for the Megillah. Now, the question, but when we look at the Megillah, so according to the Raavad, when you read the Megillah, you fulfill the mitzvah of Zikaron Amalek. Now let's consider the question. Okay, Haman was a descendant of Agag. Agag was the king of Amalek in the time of Shaul. But the truth of the matter is, the whole celebration of Purim doesn't focus on Haman being hanged, and even the 10 sons, though that might have happened later. But Haman was hung. It seems Pesach time. It was almost another year when the soldiers that Haman established, the army that Haman prepared, went to war against the Jewish people. Only when that army was eliminated was there a celebration of Purim. Was the celebration of Purim. On Yud Gimel Adar. In Shushan, it continued on Yudal Radar. Only when they were at peace, when they didn't have to worry anymore about Amalek attacking. So the general focus, the celebration of Purim, seems it's not just because of Haman, but it's because of the elimination of an army of Persians. So when we read about the elimination of the army of the Persians, we fulfilled the mitzvah of Zachor and Amalek. Who said to those soldiers, yeah, perhaps, it's not even Parsha that it was that way, but perhaps Haman, as the Targum Sheni and Megillah says, Haman was a descendant of Amalek. It could be suggested that he was only a descendant of Agag. And even Agag, the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim, he doesn't talk about Agag, but he says that the practice among the nations of the world, and specifically among the nations that are descendant from Esav, was to take a king from outside their own ranks. As contrasted to the Jewish people, who mikerev achecha tosim alecha melech, as contrasted to the Jewish people who took from their own brothers as king. And so why is this Zachor and Amalek? Now, when it comes to the pasuk in the parshas Zachar, when it comes to the pasuk in parshas Beshalach, which we read on Purim, we say Milchama LaHashem ba'Amalek midor dor. There's a war against Amalek in every generation. And my uncle quoted in the name of Reb Chaim. He said he heard it from my grandfather, who said it over in the name of Reb Chaim, that a nation who wages battle against the Jewish people, even if they're not genetically Amalek, I've discussed this before, even if they're not genetically Amalek, but they have the ideology of Amalek, a nation that is determined to destroy the Jewish people in the manner that Amalek was determined to destroy the Jewish people. So they come within the pasuk of Milchama LaHashem ba'Amalek midor dor. There is a mitzvah to wage war against them in every generation. And even though the nation of Amalek ceased to exist as a nation, but any nation that has this ideology of Amalek is included in the mitzvah of Milchama LaHashem ba'Amalek midor dor. There's a war against Amalek in every generation, because in every generation there is a nation that has the ideology of Amalek. So in other words, the war against Amalek is not just against the nation of Amalek, the genetic Amalek. It's against a nation that has the ideology of Amalek as well, which means a nation whose goal is the destruction of the Jewish people, which, to a large degree, was the attitude of the government of Iran. It's well known that the ultimate goal of Iran was the destruction of the Jewish nation. And when they speak about the destruction of the Jewish nation, they mean destruction of the Jewish people. So Iran is in a sense the the Amalek of this generation. It's certainly the Persia of all generations, but it's the Amalek of this generation. As it was, as a large part of it was, I should say, in the generation of Mordechai and Esther. And since there's a mitzvah to wage war, a war of defense against the nation who is determined, who has as its goal the destruction of the Jewish people, the mitzvah of Schiras Amalek is to remember it. Because in remembering it, even after that nation is destroyed, in remembering it, we see the influence of Amalek throughout the generations. There are those who believe that when the nation of Amalek came to an end, the influence of Amalek came to an end. But that's not true. The influence of Amalek was given over from generation to generation, but not just within one nation. It was given over from generation to generation as well as from nation to nation. And this is the enemy of the Jewish people, the ultimate enemy of the Jewish people that we are encountering today. And so this is what Reb Chaim said. My uncle, and I've mentioned it many times before, he went a step further, suggesting the possibility that Milchama B'Hashem B'Amalek Midor Dor is not just against the nation who is determined to destroy the Jewish people, who is anti-Semitic in its philosophy, but even a nation that attacks the Jewish people. The Rambam says that there is a mitzvah, that's a mechemes mitzvah, to wage war against an enemy who attacks the Jewish people. And the question is, where is that mitzvah? And my uncle suggested it's a milchama l'Hashem b'amalek midor dor, because any nation that attacks the Jewish people is considered halachically to be considered a nation that has the ideology of Amalek. But a person could suggest that while it is true that it's a mechemes mitzvah to wage war, a war of defense against a nation who wages war against the Jewish people, it's a mechemes mitzvah, there's no doubt about that. But could be for other reasons. The Miri says, my father would always quote the Miri and the Medrash Tanchuma, Tzoror es hamidyanim ki tzorim hein lechem. Eradicate, destroy, harass the Midianites because they harass you. Mikan, the Medrash Tanchuma says, and the Miri quotes it, Habor laharcha hashkem lahar go. If someone comes to destroy you, doesn't mean you have to wait till they step over the border when they're setting up rockets to kill you. That's already habor laharcha hashkem lahar go. When they set up rockets and they talk how they're going to destroy the Jewish people. So they become rodfim as a nation. They become pursuers as a nation. And it's a war of self-defense. So there are two approaches. From Reb Chaim's approach, it seems that you have two types of Mechemes Yisrael miyat tzor sheba alehem. One is a war against Amalekios. And according to the way my uncle says it over, he identifies that in a limited way. Doesn't have the exact same halachas, but it's a war against Amalek. And then, of course, any nation that attacks the Jewish people, there's a mitzvah of waging war against them. But my uncle identified the two together suggested that it could be that the two are one. In different sets of notes, and could be at different times, my uncle expressed it differently. But in one of the articles, and it was written by my uncle himself, he suggests in a footnote that when the Rambam talks about Milchemes Yisrael Miyat Sor Shabal Lehem, the war of the Jewish people against the nation who attacks them, it comes within Milchama Hashem Ba'amalek Midor Dor. But according to Reb Chaim, it seems that you have genetic Amalek, you have a nation who has the ideology of Amalek, and then there's a mitzvah against any nation that attacks the Jewish people. Now, I want to understand, what is the difference? First of all, I want to understand, and the truth of the matter is, it's very interesting. In Parshas B'Shalach, the Torah says, "Ksov zo sikoran b'sefer v'sim ba'azne Yoshua," and the Gra was already troubled. The Brisker Rav discusses it. It says, "Ksov zo sikoran b'sefer," write it in the sefer, write it in the Sefer Torah about Amalek, to be a remembrance from the Sefer Torah, which would imply, as some say, that the mitzvah Zikaron Amalek has to be from the Sefer Torah. Perhaps the Nevi'im and Ksuvim are included in it. But the Simbasna Yoshua put it into the ears of Yoshua also. It's not enough to be in the Sefer Torah. You have to oralize it. And the question is, why do you have to oralize it? If it's in the Sefer Torah, Yoshua was the successor of Moshe. He would certainly give it over. Why V'sim Bosna Yoshua? Why specifically here by Amalek is it mentioned? There was a Torah Shabbat Pen, the rest of the Torah as well. Whatever mitzvah there is in the Torah, it doesn't always say V'sim Bosna Yoshua. How are we to understand it? V'sim Bosna Yoshua. Specifically by Amalek, put into the ears of Yoshua. But I think the Parsha, if we say it's limited to the Parshas in the Torah, that's to recognize that we are acting on behalf of God. It's not just our personal war against Amalek. When we read it from the Torah, we see that. The masses see it. What's for Simbazna Yoshua? Yeah, there is a Torah Shabbat Peh, but there is an oral Masorah also. This is the Masorah that first generation from Europe gave over. The Amalek is not limited to genetic Amalek. It includes all the nations that had the philosophy of Amalek. And what is the philosophy of Amalek? The destruction of the Jewish people. I will get into it a little bit more. And it's the destruction of the Jewish people. That continues to this day. Nazi Germany, Iran, they're all Amalekios. One has to be blind and stupid to not recognize that they are interested and were interested in the destruction of the Jewish people. How stupid could people be? This senator from New York who has the chutzpah to call himself the Shomer Yisrael. He's the Shomer Yisrael because he's Jewish. To me, he's the Shomer Yisrael because he is like the Jewish police that the Nazis had to watch over the Jewish people, to lead them to their deaths. At least they were forced to do it. But he does it because he foolishly believes that will save his career. The capos. We have capos today among us. And they don't have the excuse that some of the capos had in the concentration camps. Some of the capos actually did their best to help the Jews. And the capos today are doing their best to foolishly think that they're helping their political career. So the milchama against Amalekios is something that's Simbas Yoshua. The Torah doesn't talk about Nazi Germany. The Torah doesn't talk about Iran. Megillah talks a little bit about Iran of the past, but we have Iran of the present. That's Amalek. That's Amalekios. That's the Simbas Yeshua. And the first generation, my generation, because many of my friends were children of survivors. And even my parents who came before the war to America, they didn't keep it a secret. They didn't think it was better for us not to know about the past. But for some reason, because of other loyalties that the later generations have, that they find more important than their Jewishness, than their Masorah. So because of these other loyalties, these people are trying to forget the past, or they want to push the past to the past and say it has nothing to do today. That's Zachor. Remember, we have to remember, because history repeats itself. And if we don't show opposition to Amalek, if we find that there are loyalties that are more important than our loyalties to the Jewish people and to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then we are giving aid to Amalek. The Zohar says there is Amalek among the Jewish people. This is a form of Amalek among the Jewish people. This man who calls himself the Shomer Yisrael, the capo of today, he is identified with the Amalek within the Jewish people. Now, but the question is, what is the difference? What is the difference between Amalekios and a nation that attacks the Jewish people? It's very interesting. The Torah in Parshas Beshalach, which we're going to read on Purim, says, Macho emcha Zachar Amalek, I will destroy. And by the Mabul, God said, Emcha, I will destroy mankind. And the Baal Turim points out the connection. And he says, because Shaul, HaKadosh Baruch Hu was angry at Shaul, because he did not use HaKadosh Baruch Hu's approach. He was fighting God's war. It should be Emcha, just like by the Mabul, when it comes to Amalek. In other words, the nation of Amalek represents the Dor HaMabul, according to the Baal Turim, Parshas Beshalach. And the question is, what's the equation between the Dor HaMabul and Amalek? And I think when in Parshas Noach, when the Torah tells us why God is destroying Amalek, destroying the Dor HaMabul, destroying mankind with the exception of Noach and his family, God says that rak kol hayom. He's only bad. All his thoughts is a bad all day long. And when he talks about after the Mabul, after the flood, why he's not destroying, because the evil inclinations of man is bad from his youth. And the question is, both emphasize that man is bad. And here it's used as a reason to destroy the world, and there it's used as a reason not to destroy the world. But Ramin Urav means, I once heard from my father, Ramin Urav means that it's immaturity. We all become adults, but there are aspects of immaturity that remain with us. And sometimes we act in an improper manner, but it's immaturity. You can be immature when you're 70 years old also. I'm 76. I have aspects of immaturity. I have to work to mature myself in those areas. Rak, kol hayom. But if all my thoughts would be only bad all day long, that means in my essence, I am bad. And then there's no hope for the world. That is the difference between Amalekios and those who sometimes wage war for economic reasons against the Jewish people. Of course, the Jewish people have to defend themselves irregardless of the situation. But there is a difference between Amalek and Iran on one hand, between the Nazis and Iran on one hand, and others that are not so friendly with the Jewish people. They're all laws of defense. But with others, of course, we have to defend ourselves right now. But there's hope for a change. Ramin Urav, there's hope for a change. And we have to be prepared. Because if we always say, we'll be able to deal with it later, there might not be a later. But when it comes to Amalekios, with the essence of the person is hatred of the Jew, as Iran, as Nazi Germany, there's no hope for change. Maybe people can imagine things, but there's no hope for change. That's why by Amalek, according to the Baal Turim, it's identified with the generation before the Mabul. It's time that we have to remember the past. If we remember each incident separately, it's difficult to say it's not Amalekios. It's difficult to say that it's Amalekios. Oh, there's this incident. And when this incident is over, so as a person who didn't know how to think said, just declare victory. You survived. Only to have the same problem many times over later on. But when we put the history all together, when it's Choyim Solam and Zachor Asher Asa L'cha Amalek and Pakadati Es Asher Asa Amalek Yisrael, when we see the deeds remind us of the original Amalek who was determined to destroy the Jewish people, even to the degree, as the Medrash says, to jump into a hot pot that will destroy them. As the Iranians, they knew what would happen if they gave up their programs, if they didn't give up their programs, that whose ultimate goal would be the destruction of the Jewish people. People isolate, say, "Oh, they're agreeing," and they agreed beforehand, and they were given money that they used to that was used for the October 7th destruction that took place from Gaza? Who gave them that money that they gave to the people of Gaza, that they gave to Hamas? The United States gave them that money. In a sense, those that supported that action, those that don't take a strong stand now against Amalek, those that stand with the capo from New York, they are at the Amalekim among the Jewish people. We have to hope that this will be Milchama Lashem Ba'Amalek Midor Dor. This will be the end of the of the enemy of Amalek and of Amalekios against the Jewish people. That we should be Zocha to see Mashiach b'mehera b'yameinu. It's interesting. The end of the Haggadah tells us that Purim is a holiday that will be forever. For most of the holidays after the Churban were the rabbinic holidays were taken away. Purim was not, but even more than that, Liyamosa Mashiach, Purim will also be there. Why? Why does it considered so relevant? But the answer is Purim is a celebration of the destruction and the victory over the perpetuation of Amalek. And the ultimate destruction of the perpetuation of Amalek and Amalekius will be when Mashiach comes. We celebrate today because we have survived Amalek and Amalekius. And when Mashiach comes, Purim will be even more relevant because it'll be the celebration of the total destruction of Amalek and Amalekius.
If anyone has questions, please put them in the chat. Yeah, there aren't any questions in here, so thank you, everyone. Have a good Purim.
Okay.
Tomorrow for the happy fast day.
Okay. According to some shitas. Okay.
I saw you write it that way.
I know. Okay.
Okay, have a good week,
Okay.
everyone, and happy Purim.
Okay.